Hello and welcome. Nice to have you all joining us this evening. Thank you very much for coming to the VPR event, Finding Balance, Managing Your Mental Health in a Heavy News Cycle. I want to thank all of you for joining us on this rainy, at least in Chittenden County, rainy spring evening. And I know you can't see each other, but I hope the collective energy of the many hundreds of you who are registered for this event are sort of reverberating through the atmosphere. And so we feel a sense of collective togetherness, which so many of us have had to make do with over the past year. I'd also like to thank Champlain College and Mountain View Natural Medicine for supporting this event and for all of you supporting this event in so many ways and supporting VPR over the years. I'm Jane Lindholm. I host Vermont Edition here on VPR until tomorrow, which is my very last day on the show. And I also make our kids' podcast, But Why? And I'm so pleased to welcome our guest for this evening, Sam Sanders. Hi, Sam. What a pleasure to have you with us.
It's so great to be here. Thank y'all for having me.
So as many of you know and are eagerly awaiting to hear about, Sam is a correspondent and the host of NPR's It's Been a Minute. And if you are not familiar with It's Been a Minute, get with the program because it's awesome. It really brings together and engages with journalists, actors, musicians, and listeners to gain a perspective on the events of the news that really can only be done through conversation. VPR airs this program Saturdays at 10 a.m. And a little bit more about Sam, just so you know his impressive background. He was a key member of NPR's election unit, covering the intersection of culture and politics in the 2016 election. And he was embedded with the Bernie Sanders campaign for many months. And that's when I first met you, Sam, when you came to VPR on one of your trips
Yeah.
with Senator Sanders. He was also one of the original
Yeah.
co-hosts of the NPR Politics podcast. Sam graduated from Harvard's Kennedy School in 2009 with a master's degree in public policy with a focus on media and politics. And he joined NPR in 2009 as a Kroc Fellow. Sam, you've also worn many other hats within the organization. It's a treat to have you with us to talk with you tonight.
It's so great to be here. I am fondly recalling my time in Vermont years ago chasing Bernie Sanders around, and I had a blast and it was super fun. And one day I'll be back in Vermont in person again.
I know, I hope so. But in the meantime, it's kind of nice. I get to see what your living room looks like. And you're in Los Angeles, right?
I'm in Los Angeles. So in the midst of the pandemic, I moved home to Texas, to San Antonio, where I'm from, and I was there about 6 months last year. But I came back to LA because I missed the beach, and I've been back in LA about a month and a half. Yeah,
Feeling good about it? Feeling good about your move
I
back?
am. I think that like this last year has just been a reminder that there are lots of different ways to do things, and we can be here and do something and be there and do something, and we can make home where we are. So I tell my friends and family this is true. I haven't had a permanent address since last July. I bounced around to a sublet in Texas near family, and then I'm actually back here house sitting for good friends. And I think the me of 3 or 4 years ago would be really anxious about that uncertainty. But I think one of the lessons that I've tried to learn in this past year is that sometimes uncertainty is okay, and we
Well,
can just deal with it.
you're bringing us to something really great because I actually want to invite those of you who are listening and watching tonight to participate. And that kind of reminder of what your present self might tell your past self is a prompt that we've been asking people to share with us. And so those of you who are watching tonight, we're asking the following question. Think back to a year ago. What's one thing you wish you could have told yourself then that would have helped you navigate this past year? And if you have an answer that you would like us to read tonight, you can pop your answer in the chat section on the right side of your screen, and we might be able to read some of the responses through the night. And Sam, I'd love to know your response to that. I mean, you sort of said the Sam of 3 or 4 years ago would have been really uncomfortable with this uncertainty, but not so much the Sam of 2020, 2021. Is that one of the things you would have told your previous self?
Yeah, I think if I could talk to Sam, the Sam of a year ago, before the lockdowns, before the pandemic became a pandemic, I would say One, go see as many movies as you possibly can in as many movie theaters as you possibly can with all the butter popcorn, because you're not going to have that for like a year. I used to love going to the movies. It is an art and a science in Los Angeles, and I had it down to a T. I knew where to go and when, and I knew how to find the right spot in this theater to have the best view. I loved it. And I still can recall the last movie I saw before lockdown. It was The Hunt. Not a great movie, but it was a movie and I loved it. And so first I would say, go see some movies. And the second thing I would say to myself of a year ago would perhaps be do less and worry about less. I think in spite of a lot of folks, myself included, missing the busyness of our normal routines before pandemic, I think we've also realized in the stillness of our lives right now is that we were doing too much before pandemic. We had overscheduled ourselves and overextended ourselves and committed to too many things in too many areas of our lives. You know, a normal week for me would include a dinner and then drinks and then I meet up with this and then a work thing and then another function and then I gotta exercise and then I gotta go over here because and I had too many things going on because I thought I should be that busy and that productive in my work life and in my personal life. And I think the pandemic has taught me that I really only actually have enough bandwidth to really do well a few things every day, you know, just a few things. And so for me, if I get everything done on the work checklist and I've got a good walk with the dog and I've got in some kind of exercise, fine. We did it, Joe. I'm allowed to like watch TV now. So telling myself that, you know, you can do less and that's fine has been helpful. And then the second part of that statement was worry less. And we'll talk about this more over the course of the hour, but I've really thought a lot about the way in which we consume the news. I've been thinking about it a lot in the Trump era, but even more so watching coverage of the pandemic the last year. And my lesson about news consumption has been that we have to probably just worry less about the news that we're consuming. And we can talk more about that later.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to one of your episodes recently with, was it Anne Helen Peterson, who was saying, you know, that we're going to
Yeah.
be exhausted when we come back to normal because we're now used to this quieter life. And maybe that's a good thing, but also we may have to ease back into socializing and social events and even being in an office with other people because our bodies and brains aren't going to be used to that for a while.
Oh, yeah. Not at all. You know, there's been gradually here in Los Angeles, outdoor distanced eating and drinking is a thing you can do again. And I've done it once or twice. And there is a very particular kind of anxiety around it. You know, I feel safe. It's done in a safe way, but thinking about what to wear, thinking about who opens the door first, thinking about how to make small talk in the real world again, like all of these things I've kind of forgotten.
I mean, I appreciate that on Zoom calls, if I need to eat, I can just turn the screen off because I don't
Oh,
like people
yeah.
watching me eat. I'm not going to be able to do that in person with people.
And there's some days where I'm just like, I don't feel pretty today. All of my Zooms will be no camera. That's fine. And everyone has to just deal with it.
Yes, everybody watching should know that Sam and I had to chat about what are you wearing tonight? What is the
We really
protocol for how
did.
we do this?
We did have that conversation. High stakes.
I think one of the things that I would tell my March 2020 self is, yes, your house is too small. It's too small for two kids, a dog, and a spouse, and it's going to feel even more, not even the size, but just the space. There's nowhere any of us can go to get away from each other at all. And it's at this point, like, yeah, we've hit the edge.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I totally get it. I was in a studio apartment in downtown Los Angeles before the pandemic hit. So I ended up being like in a box, and I would record my show facing this way, and then face the TV that way, and then the bed was there. It was a lot.
How did you manage that part of things? I've worked in the studio pretty much the whole pandemic, but for people who are working and living and then socializing on Zoom all in the same space, in the same four walls, it can feel like all of the parts of your life are blending together in not so great ways for your mental health.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is, and I was lucky. rode out the pandemic in Los Angeles and South Texas, parts of the country where I could be outdoors a lot, in nature. And by virtue of having a dog, I was walking her for miles every day as well. So I got to get outside a lot. And that was my first bit of advice. Um, we all know by now the mental and physical health benefits of just being outside in nature. And I don't have to tell Vermont folks about that. Y'all know, but I would say first do that. And then I think what I would say second is that you have to, or what I had to learn was that all of the things that had been muscle memory, I had to retrain myself on how to do those things efficiently in the midst of a pandemic work from home setup. So for about a good month or two, I kept noticing that all of the interviews I would do with guests via Zoom, remotely, they don't see me, I don't see them, and we've got headphones in, et cetera. I couldn't click with them. I couldn't connect with them. The interviews felt stiff, the interviews felt weird, and I was very angry at myself for not nailing them. And finally, about a month or two in, with help from my mental health professional, my therapist, we just talked about how the art of doing an interview is different when you aren't in a studio, when you aren't in an office, when you aren't looking at them face to face. And so the things that used to come naturally, you have to figure out how to do them again in this different context. So the kinds of things that I would use to break the ice with the guest in studio, I couldn't do anymore. I used to a lot of times bring in a small gift for my guests to say, hey, I'm glad you're here, let's chat. And that would just help them melt, right? But when you don't have that, how do you do it? So we have to relearn some of the activities. And so anyone having to go from working in an office to working from home, we had to give ourselves grace and say, even the most base elements of our job will require some personal retraining and rejiggering for us just to do them well. So how do we forgive ourselves and give ourselves grace in the midst of that process of readjustment? So yeah, forgive yourself and go outside. Was a long way of saying those two things.
Yeah, I imagine your guests would feel a little weird when the DoorDash guy, rang the doorbell in the middle of their interview and showed up with whatever your special treat was. We're getting a lot of comments.
One thing I realized in the
midst
of it, go ahead. I was going to say in the whole interviews from home, one thing I've realized more than anything else is that actors and directors always have somebody working on their lawn. I have heard so many weed whackers and leaf blowers outside of the homes of celebrities. It's like it must be their favorite hobby, getting their lawns worked on. It's crazy.
Although I will say I do appreciate hearing children in the background of so many professionals' lives now.
It's really sweet. I do like that.
It's not sweet when my children do it. My children are walking FCC violations, so I keep them very far away from any live mic. But some people's children are better behaved. Sam, I want to share with you some of the comments that we're getting from people who are watching tonight and people who sent in some responses to the prompt even before we started. Philippa says, what Philippa would tell herself from a year ago is be grateful for what I do have rather than longing for what I don't have. And I know you and I have both talked with a lot of people who have found that sense of gratitude. Even people who have had really immense struggles during this pandemic have also found a sort of profound sense of gratitude for the lives that they and we have. It's been kind of remarkable to experience and to witness.
Oh, yeah. Well, and just I think one of the beautiful things on the good days of pandemic life is that we have more time to notice the small things that are beautiful miracles in our lives every day. Like I take walks now. I just walk around and look at nature and it's pretty. And I wasn't doing that when I was running around here and there to and fro in the before times. I also think that I have found, and I hope this has been the same for folks on this call right now, that we can be a lot more grateful for the relationships that we had going into this pandemic. I think in so many ways, my closest friendships and my closest relationships with family, they've gotten stronger. They've just gotten stronger. And I've felt myself needing those people and those connections more and being less afraid to say, I need you. I'm glad you're in my life. I'm not sure how I would have made it through this year without you. And that has been one of the, silver linings of this cloud of coronavirus for me, at least.
Nancy says, if I had known a year ago what was coming, I would have paid more attention to the value of physical contact with friends and family. But the good side is I've learned to appreciate that so much more. So, another sense of appreciating what you have. Joe says, never take or give a hug for granted ever. So lots of physical touch that people are wishing they could have again and longing for. DJ Lou says, I agree with Sam. I would have told myself to slow down, Lou, do less and focus on what matters most. That is enough.
Yeah. Well, because there's so much, and we all know this, there's a lot of stuff that we do every week that we really don't want to do. We don't have to do it, but we still do it. Stop doing that. Stop doing it. There are things that we need to do in order to like live our lives. We got to go to work. We got to take care of our kids. The bills got to be paid. But some of this other stuff, if you don't have to do it and you don't want to do it, why are you doing it? That is my life motto right now. What do I really want to do? Do that.
What is it that you really want to do? You said you go for walks with your dogs, you prioritize exercise. What else?
I don't. I've gotten out of the game of like committing to social interaction just to commit to it. You got to go to this happy hour. You got to go to that party. You got to go see these people. These folks are getting together. I don't want to go out and see folks and be around folks and be with friends and loved ones unless I'm in the space to like really appreciate that time with them and give them my all. And so now when I think about connecting with folks, you have to be more deliberate and plan it more just because you got to work around COVID safety precautions. But I also think more now and say, Sam, is it really worth saying to a friend, I'll meet you for a hike at 7 p.m. on a day after you've had 4 or 5 interviews and 3 meetings and you're brain dead? Should I just say no? Is it better to say no and then come back and have a good interaction when I have the time and space for it? I've been really deliberate about that in the last year, I think.
Lorna says the message to pre-COVID Lorna would be, despite all the loss and suffering to come, watch for even small blessings and celebrate them. And I like that, Lorna. And Marla says, the more time you spend outside, the better you'll feel in every way. So, a lot of similarities here that I think so many people have found ways to appreciate it in this pandemic time. But we have a couple comments too that I think will help us get into another thing that I know you and I definitely need to discuss because we have varying degrees of success with this. Diana says, my one most important message to myself is not to listen or view so much news. News last year was so stressful and full of misinformation, and it really messed up my emotions. And Rebecca in Burlington kind of echoes the same thing, saying, put away your devices, make routine allotted time for news, like a daily podcast, Governor Scott updates, read the news on some weekdays only. And that's a great way to sort of pace yourself with the news. And similarly, Elizabeth says, the advice to pre-COVID Elizabeth is, you don't have to watch everything, get some sleep.
Yeah, she gets it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious how you do that because, I host a daily news show and I have really struggled about how to disconnect at all from the news and when to. And that was exhausting and overwhelming at times, but also felt like I didn't really have a choice about how much to consume. I felt like I needed to consume it all.
Well, this is a thing that I find so fascinating. And I've been thinking about it a lot the last few years, actually. And I think my biggest takeaway is just because there is always news out there for us to consume does not mean that we need to consume all of the news all of the time. In the same way that McDonald's in many parts of the country is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In what world would we think it's appropriate to be at McDonald's all the time, eating all the time? You shouldn't do that. And just because the options exist doesn't mean you have to fully exercise all of those options all the time. And so I think the biggest thing that I feel weird saying as someone who works in the news business, but I want to say is that you shouldn't have us on all day. You shouldn't have us on all day. We're probably a little bit too much for you. Like you figure out what your limit is and you honor that. Second, I really think you should think about how you're getting your news. consume less news that's fed to you by algorithm, consume more news that is curated for you by actual thinking people. All of the studies that we have so far, most of them come from the Pew Media Center. They say, and they've said for years, that people feel overwhelmed by the pace of news, but they also feel even more anxious when they are primarily consuming news from social media, because the very folks who lean even more into consuming news through social media say, a majority of them say, that they distrust the way the algorithm is feeding them stuff. We know this is not actually good for us. We know the algorithm on platforms like Facebook or Twitter, it accentuates the things that are very sensational. It accentuates and pushes the things that are confrontational, and it pushes us to discord. And you get less of that negative energy when the curation is coming from people who were trained to do this stuff. And so I would say less social media. Just today, I got caught up in some dumb Twitter story, and I still don't know what it is, but I know it didn't matter. This was the one, I'm sure you saw it. This guy posts on Twitter that as he's eating his Cinnamon Toast Crunch, he finds these shrimp shells in the bag of cereal coated with Cinnamon Toast Crunch, Cody crunchy stuff. And he's mad about it. And everyone's like, this is insane. Cinnamon Toast Crunch says, we didn't do that. I promise you, wasn't us. The internet tries to figure out what's going on. Now we find out that this guy was married to a former child star, and he may have a problematic background. And I see myself, as I'm saying it, I realize it's nonsensical. And I spent 45 minutes of my day going down this rabbit hole. To what end? It didn't help me. It didn't serve me. My life would have been better with one less hour of Twitter today. And so think about that, and like think about what news is worth consuming and what news is not, but also how much you need to worry based on the news that you consume. I got one more little anecdote, then I'll stop. But
yeah, although I'm alarmed that you think the cinnamon toast shrimp guy is news.
I know. Twitter made me think it was news, and it's like, actually doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter at all. But another thing, a piece of news coverage that made me really think about what our reaction as news consumers to the news should be, would be to know what we should worry about and what we can change and what we can't. So for a few weeks, I heard a few stories on TV and on the air that basically had the following gist. Which strain of coronavirus is most dangerous for you? Which strain of coronavirus is most likely to kill you? And they'd have these stories where they go through this variant and that variant, which one that one does, and then that one does. And they'd end these pieces by basically saying, but who knows? And so I would hear these pieces and I'd say, what do I do with this information? What do I do with this besides just be worried? And at that point, you got to say to yourself, regardless of the variant of the coronavirus, I'm going to wear my mask. I'm going to be safe. And that's all that I can do. And we have to fight the urge we can't let the news make us feel anxious and nervous about things we can't change. What can you change and what can't you change, and then act accordingly. And sometimes you have to hear a bad news story and just say, I can't do anything about it. I got to live my life. We feel this need to feel pain over all the negativity and to worry about all of the stuff that's anxiety inducing, but you can't do that, and you shouldn't feel the pressure to.
When you say you shouldn't feel the pressure to, do you mean that for yourself too? I mean, do you mean that for journalists whose
Oh yeah.
jobs it is to consume and analyze and digest the news, in addition to people who are just trying to be informed citizens? I mean, do you follow your own advice?
I try to. I mean, there's so much stuff to be up in arms about, to be upset about, and we see it every day. But another thing that I say to myself and to others is that, you can't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. And at a certain point, if you spend all of your day worrying and all of your day fretting and all of your day feeling bad about the state of the world, you've done nothing to take care of yourself and nothing to prepare yourself to go out and fight the good fight. You can't help anybody if you're beat down and run down by scrolling the internet to the extent that you're like having a panic attack. Then you're helping nobody, right? So how do you preserve yourself and take care of yourself to give yourself the energy to fight for what you can? That requires you saying, I can't worry about everything.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, you know, some people are sharing thoughts that I think would have been helpful to many people in finding that mental health balance earlier. Nessa in Reigate Corner says, pace yourself. This will be a marathon, not a sprint. And, I think many people were thinking about that 2 weeks to slow the spread kind of message that we were getting a year ago now, and thinking, all right, I can do this for 2 weeks. Or then, if you had children and the spring school was closed, it was like, all right, well, we can do this till we get to the summer. And I think for so many people, it's been so many more of those feelings. And even for me now, I think I managed to sort of hold it together for a long time. But Sam, you're from Texas. I don't know if you are a bull riding fan, but I used to watch a lot of bull riding in my
Nice.
younger days. And sometimes you see a rider and they're looking really great, really strong for about 6 seconds, and then those last 2 seconds they get so raggedy, and you think, oh buddy, you just got to hang on for 2 more seconds, 2 more seconds till the bell. And I kind of feel like that's where I am in the pandemic at this point. I wrote it out for 6 seconds, and now we're close, and now I'm starting to feel raggedy and like I can't quite hold it together, and I might just have to let go and slip off that bull. And so I think it's hard for people to not know where the end is and to keep thinking you're getting close, and then to have that sort of goalpost moved.
Yeah. No, it's so hard. And there's no real answer to that besides we have to just take the small wins we can take every day. We don't actually know when this is really going to be over. The vaccines are rolling out and people are getting them, but who knows? And who knows how long it will really take to get back to quote unquote normal. And all that we can do in the meantime, all that I can do in the meantime is say, like, what is the one thing that I know that I can do today? It's going to bring me joy. Maybe it is that hike. Maybe it is making that favorite meal. Maybe it is watching your favorite sitcom again with a pint of ice cream. But what one small joy or victory can we find each day in the midst of such uncertainty? And in that joy, can we find a little bit of certainty, at least for a few minutes? It's helpful. It's not a fix, but it's helpful. And I think it's about allowing yourself some indulgence. It's about allowing yourself some indulgences. You're allowed. You're allowed to have a free day. You're allowed to have a free night. You're allowed to treat yourself every now and then, because this year has been hard.
Jen says, I would encourage myself to continue with my life more instead of a total lockdown mentality. Wear a mask, but go out and do within the restrictions. And Andrea says, think about strategies to connect with people in meaningful ways that aren't in person. Also, be prepared for permanent changes to come out of this pandemic. Some will be good, some will be very transformative, and some won't be as welcome. And Susan in Lake Elmore says, I wish that I had acknowledged my overwhelming fear of dying of COVID and told myself that I needed help right now to get through this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's rough. I think one of the realities of this year of pandemic life was that it really put on display some issues that we deal with, perhaps some mental health issues that we deal with that we should have been addressing before the pandemic, and perhaps the pandemic made them crisis level for us in our lives. And I think what we can't allow to happen is this care for our mental health to fade as things begin to get back to quote unquote normal. We should still be thinking as thoughtfully about taking care of our minds as we are right now, even then.
When you think about other issues that are not about the pandemic, but are happening during the pandemic at a time of heightened stress and anxiety, when we think about the fight for racial justice that is ongoing in this country and has permeated so many lives, and one would hope has permeated more lives, more white lives, in terms of thinking about systemic injustice and racism in this country. Again, that question of how do you balance a professional need to know things and to carry on a conversation that's professional with maintaining and preserving and protecting your own humanity as you and many people move through all of these different parts of the news that are also parts of people's lives and parts of how we think about the world around us and how we fit into it.
Yeah. There's a certain way I had to learn how to consume news about shootings of unarmed Black people. I think when this began. And really, for me, it feels like an era ushered in by the smartphone and having video evidence of this stuff. But in the beginning of that era, I felt the need to watch the videos and consume them and watch them over and over again and analyze them. I don't watch the videos anymore. It's traumatizing, it's sad, and I can gain an understanding about the story without seeing that violence against Black and brown bodies. So I don't consume the videos, and I don't feel bad about not watching the videos, right? I think in other ways, I choose what to consume and when and how. Like with the shootings that we've seen in the last 2 weeks, I want to know the facts of the case. I want to know the names of those who were injured or killed, but I cannot spend an hour reading every story about the candlelight vigil. I can't do it. I'm grateful for the journalists doing that work, and it is vital for those who want to consume it, but I can't live in that emotion for too long. But I'm still able to have a conversation about the news that matters with these things without staying in that place. So I think it's finding what works for you in terms of news consumption. And really, for me, shifting to this mindset of saying to myself, I can know enough about a story without having to know every single detail about it. Because that's where the crazy making happens. I got to have every update. I got to see everything. I got to know every whatever. And that's not healthy. That's not healthy, you know? You don't have
Right.
to know every word in the entire textbook to pass the test, you know?
Sure. I suppose whether it's about, a really heavy and important news story, or if it's about shrimp tails and cinnamon toast crunch.
Exactly. Exactly.
Carrie in Williamstown has a question for you. Carrie says, "How are you so capable of sharing joy and to convey this super openness to others that comes across so clearly in your radio show? How are you so comfortable with yourself that it becomes a gift to others?"
Well, that is really nice. And thank you for saying that. That's really sweet and made my day. Um, I think there are two big things going on when I think about the tone of the show. You know, NPR producer, he show Action 2016. And I was
Oh, hang on, Sam. We're getting a little bit
moment
of
just felt, the
wobbly
election.
wobbly service from you. So start that answer over again. I think we've got you back now. Maybe not. Okay, so while we're getting Sam back, I'm going to read a
Can you
few
hear
more.
me?
Yeah,
Can
now
you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, there you are.
Did that fix it? And there's no delay?
There's a little delay, but I
Okay.
can hear you. It's better than
I'm
it's
very sorry.
no, it's fine.
I rebooted the Wi-Fi before this, but I should reboot it again in a minute. Where did I cut off? And I'll pick it back up again.
Start over again and answering Carrie's question altogether. How do you have this sense of openness and transparency that becomes such a gift to others who are listening to you?
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you for that question and comment. It's very nice and makes me feel special. And I think the big answer would be that there were two things going on. One is that we wanted to make sure the show wasn't depressing. I think coming out of the election of 2016 and launching the show after that, I knew that the current pace and state of news had been depressing me. And hearing the news all day made me kind of sad. And so I said purposefully, how do we make a show that tells you what you need to know about the week of news and what's going on in the world without making it depressing? So that was the first intention. And so we just approach it that way. And then I think the second was that we just, and I just personally made a promise to the show and the audience that we would put an optimistic foot forward. You know, no one is always optimistic, but when I'm on a microphone talking to people who I value and respect, that's the promise I made them. I want you to leave the show feeling a little bit better than when you started listening to it, and I want to give a spirit of optimism and joy to the best that I can. And the other parts of me that are a little grumpy and crabby and can be kind of an asshole, I'll save that for my friends, but what I'm going to give my listeners every week is what I promise them, which is optimism. And I think that requires a few things. I think that we purposely try to lean into the emotional aspect of all of these stories. People feel things about the news, and I want us to talk about that in a real way. And I also lean into conversations about identity and who we are and who we think we are and how that affects how the news affects all of us. Being from a marginalized background affects how the news is interpreted by you and what it means to you. The news can feel different based on gender differences, and our sense of who we are shapes how we see the world. How can we talk about that too? But in general, in terms of the tone of the show, I just knew I didn't want to have a show that depressed people. And I knew that I wanted to bring optimism and joy to listeners to the best of my ability. And joy, I think, is a choice. I think my personal philosophy about joy is that, like, you can choose to be joyful. You can choose to celebrate the positive. Even if you're unhappy that day, you can choose joy, because joy is a pursuit. The pursuit of joy is noble and worthwhile. And at least for an hour a week, I can do that. It's nice to do.
You've also taken a different approach to hosting, and some of it may be the format of the show, which started as a podcast and is now both a podcast and a broadcast show, but also is just generally a different approach to talking about the news from a host's perspective. You don't have that sort of buttoned up, I am not a real person, I am conveying the news, but I could be anybody kind of approach. You bring your whole self to those interviews, even the ones that are about news. And that feels different, I think, to many people.
Oh, thank you. I think when the show first started, a lot of that personal in my hosting, I kind of called it the George W. Bush model. I remember when George W. Bush attended Donald Trump's first inauguration, and it was weird. And he's asked after inauguration what it was like. George W. Bush looks in the camera and he says, "That was some weird shit." And I loved it. And it was George W. Bush unleashed and candid and telling you how he really felt about this thing. And that was the thing that I remembered more than even like Trump's speech that day. And I think that people admire and like to listen to other people saying how they really feel. It makes for a more compelling interview when you kind of know a little bit what I'm thinking too. I also found that as an interview tactic over time, the guests that I'm interviewing give me more when I give them more of me. If I tell them more about me, they tell them more about themselves. Simple. So in some cases, I'm happy to tell them everything if it means they'll tell me everything. And in the process, the listeners get to hear that too.
But it also breaks the fourth wall. I mean, there are a lot of questions in journalism today about that idea of objectivity, and I think there's a little bit of an understanding that objectivity may not be quite what we're striving for, or neutrality, or a sort of neutral stance that doesn't take any kind of perspective on the news. And so, I think you're bringing an approach that says not that you're not a journalist, not that you are not a professional, not that you don't have an obligation to seek the truth, but that just pure neutrality is not necessarily the goal when we're talking about the news or even talking to people who we're interviewing as interesting creative forces, that it's not just a blank slate on which to pose questions, as if those questions don't have a perspective and a point of view that they're coming from in the first place.
Yeah, it's not possible to do, and I've been doing a little bit of research into the history of objectivity in journalism. What we don't understand is that, like, objectivity was not etched out in the 10 commandments of journalism that were written thousands of years ago. Objectivity was something created at a certain point that we just kind of held on to. And when it was created, we forget that, like, as much as it was a journalistic imperative, it was a business decision. The very idea of journalistic objectivity came in an era in which a lot of large media dynasties were breaking into smaller ones, and everyone and all these small outlets were competing for as large of an audience as they possibly could. And the way to do that was to appeal to as many white news consumers as possible. And the way to do that was to be neutral or objective, so that white Democrats and white Republicans would consume your newspaper and not just half of them. Right? It was a business decision that got dressed up in a cloak of journalistic standard. And I think that there are some good things that come out of objectivity, but it's also a choice and a business decision. And knowing that, we can say maybe that worked then and doesn't work now. And, I'm not on my show ever saying I support this politician or not that one. That's not what I'm doing. But I am saying that who I am and how I move through the world and how I work as a journalist is not at all neutral. It is informed by really real lived experience. And I don't want to neutralize my experience. I don't want to neutralize the wisdom I've gained by living a life. I want to share it with you. And I want my listeners to share it with me because there's more growth in that. There's so much more in that.
Let's come back to some of the comments that we're getting from listeners and viewers to this today, too. A lot of people echoing that idea that you don't need to consume the news all the time. Lisa says, more music, less news. I don't need to know everything. Michelle says, strictly, my husband would not watch or listen to the news for the last 4 years, but recently started to check in on headlines, which strangely resulted in me consuming less, lessening my anxiety. And Michelle says, sharing the burden. And then Martha says, I purposefully listen to local news where I can do something about it. Not that the national and international news doesn't matter, but I have to take care of myself by feeling empowered. And I think, that goes, Sam, to what you were talking about earlier about thinking carefully about the sources of where you get your news and what it is you're trying to get out of the news you're consuming. Are you just trying to be informed to know what's happening in the world? Are you trying to be informed so you know how to go about your daily life and what the policies are in your state or your region? Are you trying to, take action and you need to know something so you can decide how to take action and call your elected representatives or go to a march? I mean, I think there are lots of reasons to consume the news, and perhaps we don't think very carefully about what it is we're trying to get out of it before we just start devouring it.
Yeah. Well, and there's so many times where we devour the news because we're bored, and then we just replace our boredom with anxiety. That didn't help. That didn't help. Go do a jigsaw puzzle if you're bored.
Elliot shared with us, I would tell myself, my pre-pandemic self, that I would be able to see my mother before she died. She lives in Toronto and has leukemia. 2 weeks ago, I was able to get up to see her at last. I will never forget that hug.
Wow. I'm so sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you got to see her.
Yeah, I've been holding a lot of space in the last year for people who are grieving. And, we think about the 500,000 American lives lost to COVID-19, and then so many other lives that have been changed or altered irrevocably, and that people haven't necessarily been able to grieve in the ways that they normally would, or come together or share that last hug. And whether the person you love has died of COVID-19 or something else, the fact that we can't all be together in this time just has been a tragedy for many people. And so, I think throughout this conversation, we're having a lot of it is balancing mental health needs and news consumption and finding time to go outside. But there just are a lot of people who are just terribly sad and devastated by some of the changes that have happened, and just worth holding space for those people tonight too.
Yeah. And I think that it's important as we go through this moment of collective trauma together to know that our grieving process will take some time, and we'll still be grieving all of this loss in some ways, even after we've been vaccinated, even after concerts and festivals and restaurants and bars come back. Grief is weird, and it often takes longer than we think. And we have not yet truly, I think, grieved all that we've lost in this moment. And it will take time, and we have to give ourselves grace as we experience that weird, malleable emotion of grief over time.
Yeah, and a grief that in some cases is suspended now and may come back at strange times and in strange ways for people as our world changes back.
Yeah, well, because so much of our lives we're just on autopilot trying to make it right now, especially for parents having to raise and educate their kids from home. You don't have any, you don't have time for anything but survival. And so at what point do those emotional floodgates open for you? It might not happen until the kids are safely back in school, might not happen until you get that first real vacation. The grief might hit you when it hits you, and we don't know when that happens, and we have to give ourselves space for that and not beat ourselves up when we're crying about something weird in a grocery store a year from now. Fine, let it happen.
I was in high school in the 90s and was a fan of Alanis Morissette in my high school days and college days. And she came out with a new album in the last year. And one of the songs is about her children. And the chorus is, my mission is to keep the light in your eyes alive. And there's something about, an artist who reminds you of your own youth and has that like huge emotional power that comes with somebody who you listen to in that dramatic and emotional time of your life. And I would put that song on sometimes and go for a run in the woods where I knew I wouldn't run into anybody and just ugly cry. And there's nothing
Oh yeah.
uglier than crying while running, but just like let the tears flow while thinking about, yes, I mean, and to me, to sort of give myself that grace of saying, yeah, my job is not to make my children do everything they're supposed to do, but just to keep that light alive. And that part of that for me was taking the time to go be by myself and exercise and cry.
Yeah, my crying music last year while walking my dog in the woods was mostly Phoebe Bridgers. There were two or three songs of hers where I knew if I hit play, it was going to be waterworks, needed waterworks, you know?
Sometimes you need that spark to get yourself
Yeah.
to the tears.
Yeah.
David's advice to pre-pandemic David is it's okay to grieve all kinds of things. The loss of a pet, missed vacation, time with friends and family. It's all okay to grieve that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Nikki says, it's amazing how honest and open we can be with each other about how we're doing and be there for each other, even virtually. Delilah says, I wish I had known this would last so long. I would have taken more vacation time to see friends and family. And Sam, we have a question for you from Lori, who wants to know if Aunt Betty is real.
Oh, she's so real. She's so real. So Aunt Betty is one of my mother's sisters. My mother has five siblings, four brothers and four sisters and one brother. And Aunt Betty lives in Dover, Delaware, where she's lived for quite a long time. But yeah, she's real. She's kind of like my second mom. We decided to have her in the show early on because Brent Bachman, the founding producer of the show, he's obsessed with late night and he wanted to have an announcer in the same way that so many late night shows have like an announcer. And Brent was like, who do you think you should do it? And I said, the only person in my family who consistently listens to everything that I do is probably Aunt Betty. Ask her. So we did. We didn't think she was going to be a hit, but she has been. People really like her. And I think it is a really wonderful grounding device for the show. I don't get to be highfalutin voice of God journalist when I'm on a call with my Aunt Betty because she's in charge, you know? And so having her in the show is just this reminder that like that she's just important as me and we're just important as each other and we're all talking about this weird crazy world together.
How has fame changed Aunt Betty?
It's funny, she every now and then she'll get noticed. And oh God, she's such a ham. She loves it. She pretends to be coy and demure, but and she'll be sitting still when it's time to take a picture. She's just ready to go, ready to go. So no, she loves it a lot.
You have Aunt Betty. I noticed that when Aisha Roscoe's been filling in for you as the host of the show a few times, she sometimes has her kids be her
She has her
opening act.
kids. Yeah, and those kids are great. You know, when I've had Aisha on the show as a guest, her kids have made cameos, and I'm all about the kid content, especially in the midst of the pandemic. You know, my editor has two children, and honestly, every other Zoom meeting, I'm asking her, "Can you put the kids on for a second? I would love to see what Ian and Maddie are up to today." I'm all about it, and I think I hope that one of our takeaways from this pandemic, is that like we can admit in our jobs and our work lives that families exist. Families exist, children exist, partners exist. None of us would be here without family. And it's okay to acknowledge that even in and at work.
How does that though then translate into policy or change? Because, I think there is some acknowledgement that kids exist, which is nice, but that's different than acknowledging the need for flexible schedules when there's not a pandemic, or paid family leave, which many people advocate for, or the fact that sometimes things aren't going to go quite right, and you might need to leave work early, or there are all of these things in people's lives that we're offering more grace for now, and I wonder if that will continue post-pandemic.
Yeah, well, and at a certain point, it's like, when does the grace that we're offering to support family turn into actual support? You know, what would it mean to subsidize some of these things and say, we value family and parenthood so much, we're going to help you pay for it. I say we, I don't know who the we is, but that's the next conversation. Childcare costs money. Taking off time to take care of kids cost money. Educating kids from home cost money. And policy at the federal, state, and local level is often about where the money goes. When does our family and those priorities come into that conversation?
We're still getting a lot of Aunt Betty love in the comments from people tonight. And Amy is really ready for some Aunt Betty merch. Any t-shirts, beanies, anything that we're going to get with Aunt Betty on it?
It's funny. I was telling my team the other week, I was like, I have an idea for a Betty shirt. And it'll just be like a cartoon image of her face. And on top of it, it'll say, hey, y'all, this is Sam's Aunt Betty, with like an arrow pointing to Aunt Betty. I don't know. Maybe one day. I don't know how those things work. The shop does what the shop does. We'll see.
Sam, we haven't talked much about specific episodes of the show that have moved you or that, have been real highlights for you over the past year. But I want to offer you a little bit of space to talk about some of your favorite interviews, which I know is always such a hard question to give to a host, because it's like, oh gosh, which interview am I going to highlight? But I'm sure you have a few.
I recently really enjoyed my chat with the journalist Anne Helen Peterson. We had her be part, and you've already mentioned the chat, but she was a part of our pandemic anniversary episode, looking back on 1 year of pandemic life. And she had written this essay I love that I wanted her to talk about with my audience. And she basically was saying, don't feel the urge to feel like you once it's normal again. Changed for herself, afraid that the way that you grieve is extended and drawn, usually over time. And hearing her tell me to my face to fight the urge to just party as soon as I can, vacation as soon as I can, do all the things as soon as I can, to say, it's okay, wait, even going back to normal is new and strange. Be careful with yourself. That felt very good. Who else did I really enjoy? I thoroughly enjoyed a chat I had with Bowen Yang. He is a cast member on SNL, and we talked a lot about his comedic work and what it means to be one of the few celebrities of Asian descent in comedy right now. And he was very candid and thoughtful about the work that he does and the very serious effects of comedy, on the world. Who else? I interviewed Sola. She became famous as a chef on the Bon Appetit Test Kitchen, but now she is doing her own thing. And we had this really wonderful exchange where she was quite candid and told me about one of her best moments of the pandemic year being taking shrooms and just getting really high and gaining a new appreciation for life and everything. And it was so unexpected and so surprising. And I was surprised they even let us put it on public radio stations, but it was beautiful and I liked it. And it was one of my favorites of the last year.
I was curious in listening to that episode, what was running through your head. And if you were thinking, yeah, maybe I'll give that a try, or that is not going to be for me.
The first thing I did, as soon as she went there, I started slacking my team. I said, I don't give a damn what anyone says. I don't care what legal says. I don't care what management says. We run this. It's good tape. We run this. So that was my first thought. Like, how do you make sure this is preserved? And then my second thought was just like, if Sola can take shrooms, the nicest, sweetest little person in the world, I guess they must not be that bad. That was my second thought.
I really enjoyed and appreciated an interview you did recently with the author Tori Peters and her new book, Detransition Baby. And I loved the conversation you had with her, but also it gave me a great idea for the next book I want to read, which will go onto the stack of other books that I want to read next and don't have time to read.
Yeah, yeah. Hers was a really interesting conversation because I think it gets at really one of the central themes of the show itself, which is we all don't have to be the same and come from the same places to learn from each other. She's writing this book as a trans woman through a purposefully trans lens, but they're lessons about gender and parenthood and family that are applicable to all of us, regardless of our gender ID. And that is when I think the show is firing on all cylinders, when we're attempting to acknowledge the differences that exist in us, but still find some common ground that will always still be there. Also, the book is really good. It's a really good book. You should for sure read it.
Is there an audio version of it? Because that I can handle. I've been reading books while I run now, just listening to them.
I'm sure there is, but I'll check on it and I'll let you know. Yeah.
Thanks, please. You're going to be my own personal NPR book concierge now?
Yeah.
Sally in Lincoln is responding to our prompt of, what would you tell your pre-pandemic self, and says, the introvert side of me has become powerful and validated. Playing it safe and fiercely defending my decision to do so has gotten me and the people who are close to me through this year. And, Sally seems to echo, I think, what you were talking about with Anne Helen Peterson, this idea that you don't have to rush back to your pre-pandemic normal. You can find a new normal, but also some of the things that have come out of this year may be things that you want to keep and preserve in your life. That, there are some things I think in US schools, in policies, in how we interact with one another, in accessibility that we may want to keep and build upon after this is over. I'm going to pretend that Sam is agreeing with me because
you froze a little bit. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. You froze too.
I am. Am I back? I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that.
I have to tell you, Sam, this is not one of the things that we want to keep post-pandemic, is the interrupted conversations where one side or the other is freezing all the time.
No, I apologize. It's probably on my end. I need to get this figured out. But I will say there are a lot of things I hope we don't return to. Specifically, office life. I remember vividly, even though it seems far away now, fighting LA traffic to be at the office at a certain time, to just be there, answering the same emails I could have answered at home. It's like, being really, really, really careful with where I am and where I do my work, knowing that I can do my work in several places. And this idea of hard, rigid, and fast rules about time and where we are, I hope that never comes back. And I hope that we're all allowed to be as flexible as we need to be and still get the jobs done.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I hope that for those of you tonight who, haven't found the grace and the gratitude in this pandemic, that life eases up and gets easier. Because again, for so many people, this has been such a challenge. And even for those of us who have found the gratitude and the happiness and the joy, there's still a lot of pain and struggle and challenge. And so finding some balance where there's less of that pain and challenge and struggle and maybe more of the gratitude and joy and togetherness is what I'm hoping for all of us as we move, we hope, out of this pandemic stage and into something else. We don't know what yet, but something
else. Yeah. And I would say this whole year went by, I didn't learn how to make sourdough bread, and it's okay. It's fine. I'll live.
I think that's the biggest takeaway. It's okay if you did not learn how to.
It's okay. It's okay.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's such a pleasure to have you with us virtually here in Vermont and to be able to bask in your voice and your vision, and to learn a little bit more about how you balance mental health and news consumption and all of the other things you're grappling with. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for having me. VPR holds a special place in my heart. And the next time we chat, I guarantee you it'll be in person with no spotty Wi-Fi on my end, which I apologize for.
Everybody, Sam Sanders, host of It's Been a Minute on NPR, and please carry along the greetings and gratitude to Aunt Betty from all of the Vermonters who are watching tonight. Anna St. Marie produced tonight's event. Special thanks to the VPR events team, Ty Robertson and Michelle Owens. And thank you so much to all of you for watching and listening tonight, and again for your support of VPR. Good night, Sam. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.